July 2, 1944. Normandy, France. Oberst Rudolf von Gersdorff stood in a command bunker outside Saint-Lô, studying defensive maps with grim satisfaction. The bocage, ancient Norman hedgerow country, had become Germany's unexpected fortress. These living walls of earth, stone, and centuries-old vegetation, some reaching 12 feet high and 15 feet thick, divided the countryside into thousands of small enclosed fields. Each hedgerow was a natural tank obstacle, each field a potential killing zone. "The Americans are trapped," von Gersdorff told his operations officer, pointing at the map. "Their armor cannot penetrate the hedgerows. Their infantry cannot advance without armor support. Each field becomes a separate battle. We calculated they would break out of the beaches in days. Instead, they are still fighting for yards after 4 weeks. The bocage is defeating them more effectively than our best-prepared defenses." Von Gersdorff's analysis was accurate. American armored divisions designed for rapid breakthrough operations were paralyzed. Tanks attempting to climb over hedgerows exposed their thin belly armor to German Panzerfaust teams waiting on the other side. Trying to drive through the earthen barriers was impossible. The roots and compressed soil were harder than concrete. Attempting to flank around meant traveling on narrow lanes where German anti-tank guns waited in ambush. German doctrine held that armored breakthrough in bocage terrain was tactically impossible. Tanks required open terrain for maneuver. The hedgerows eliminated maneuver space. Therefore, American armor was neutralized. The Allied advance would stall, casualties would mount, and eventually political pressure would force negotiation rather than continuing this meat grinder. What von Gersdorff didn't know was that 30 miles behind American lines, a sergeant from Tennessee, with a welding torch and scrap metal from destroyed German obstacles, was about to make the tactically impossible routine. Within 72 hours, American ingenuity would transform standard Sherman tanks into hedgerow-busting monsters that would rip through bocage defenses like paper, turning Germany's impenetrable fortress into a shooting gallery. Before we dive into how a simple field modification by American soldiers completely revolutionized bocage warfare and turned the Normandy stalemate into a German rout, I need your help for just 3 seconds. This channel brings you the untold stories of World War II, the field innovations and soldier ingenuity that won battles but never make it into official histories. YouTube only promotes these videos when they see engagement happening. So if you're fascinated by how American soldiers turned impossible tactical problems into solved problems using nothing but creativity and scrap metal, hit that like button right now. Takes 1 second, helps this reach more history enthusiasts. And subscribe with notifications on. Next week's story about the 19-year-old who designed the proximity fuse that shot down 850 V-1 rockets is absolutely mind-blowing. Now, let's see how Sergeant Curtis Culin's hedgerow cutter, built from Hitler's own beach obstacles, broke open Fortress Europe and proved that American ingenuity was more powerful than any defensive doctrine. The Bocage Fortress. The Norman bocage wasn't designed as defensive terrain. It evolved over centuries as farmers divided land with earthen banks planted with hedgerows. But by June 1944, these ancient agricultural boundaries had become the deadliest terrain American forces would face in Europe. The typical bocage field measured 200 to 400 yards per side, enclosed by hedgerows 10 to 15 feet tall. The hedgerows themselves were geological and botanical fortresses, a base of earth and stone 3 to 4 feet thick, topped with dense vegetation including oak, beech, and brambles, with roots penetrating 10 feet into the earthen bank. Centuries of growth had created barriers that were effectively solid walls. For infantry, each field was a separate battle. Hedgerows provided perfect concealment for defenders. Machine gun nests dug into the earthen banks were nearly impossible to spot and almost immune to artillery. Attacking infantry had to cross open fields under fire, then assault prepared positions with minimal cover. Casualty rates were horrific. Companies could lose 30 to 40% strength taking a single field. For armor, the situation was even worse. Tanks couldn't drive through hedgerows. The earthen banks would high-center the tank, leaving it immobile and vulnerable. Attempting to climb over exposed the tank's belly armor, only 1 inch thick on Sherman tanks, to German Panzerfaust and anti-tank guns positioned to fire upward at the perfect angle. The only alternative was following roads and lanes between fields, but German defenders naturally focused anti-tank weapons on these choke points. American tank crews called it murder alley, confined spaces where German guns could engage from prepared positions while American tanks had no room to maneuver. The 2nd Armored Division, arriving in Normandy expecting to conduct the rapid breakthrough operations they had trained for, instead found themselves fighting yard by yard through hedgerows. After 2 weeks, they had advanced less than 5 miles. Casualty rates for tank crews reached levels not seen since North Africa. More critically, the psychological impact was severe. Tank crews knew their vehicles were death traps in bocage fighting. General Omar Bradley, commanding U.S. First Army, faced a strategic crisis by late June. The breakout from Normandy required rapid armored advance. The bocage made rapid advance impossible. If American forces couldn't solve the hedgerow problem, the campaign would bog down into World War I-style attrition warfare. American engineers approached the problem systematically. They tried explosives, too time-consuming and dangerous, requiring engineers to expose themselves while placing charges. They tried bulldozer tanks, effective but too few available and vulnerable to anti-tank fire. They tried various blade configurations welded to tank fronts. Marginally effective, but didn't solve the fundamental problem of tanks being unable to penetrate the earthen barriers quickly. By early July, American forces had been fighting in Normandy for 4 weeks with no solution to bocage warfare in sight. Casualties were mounting. Advance rates were measured in hundreds of yards per day. German confidence that hedgerow terrain had neutralized American armored superiority seemed justified. Then, on July 2nd, Sergeant Curtis G. Culin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron walked into his unit motor pool with a sketch of a device that would change everything. The Tennessee Farmer's Solution. Curtis Culin wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a tank expert. He was a 29-year-old sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey, though he'd grown up around his grandfather's Tennessee farm, where improvised solutions to practical problems were a way of life. When faced with hedgerows that stopped tanks, Culin approached it not as a military problem requiring complex solutions, but as a practical obstacle that needed a simple tool. His logic was straightforward. If tanks couldn't drive through hedgerows because they got stuck, what if you mounted steel teeth on the front that would cut through the earthen bank like a plow through soil? The tank's weight and engine power could provide force. The steel teeth would separate and tear the compacted earth and roots. The tank could drive straight through instead of trying to climb over. The brilliant part was his material source: German Czech hedgehog beach obstacles. These welded steel anti-tank barriers, constructed by the thousands along Atlantic Wall beaches, were now scrap metal lying all over the battlefield after being blasted apart by naval gunfire and engineers. The steel was perfect, hard enough to penetrate compacted earth, already cut into manageable pieces, and available in unlimited quantities. Culin's first prototype was crude. Lengths of steel rail from destroyed hedgerows welded into prongs extending forward from a Sherman tank's front hull. 4 prongs, each about 3 feet long, angled slightly downward to bite into the earthen bank. The entire assembly weighed perhaps 800 pounds, negligible for a 30-ton tank. The test came on July 2nd, with Culin's tank commander, Lieutenant DeFrancisco, behind the controls. The Sherman approached a typical bocage hedgerow at moderate speed. The steel prongs bit into the earthen bank. The engine strained. The hedgerow, which had seemed impenetrable, began to tear apart. The tank drove straight through, emerging on the other side in seconds instead of the minutes required by previous methods. Word spread through the 102nd Cavalry within hours. Within a day, other units were asking for details. Within 3 days, the innovation had reached General Bradley's headquarters. The response was immediate. Produce as many of these devices as possible, as fast as possible. The industrial mobilization. What happened next demonstrated American military-industrial capacity at its most impressive. Not the factory production everyone associates with American strength, but field improvisation at scale. Ordnance companies across Normandy received orders. Fabricate hedgerow cutters from available materials. Install on all Sherman tanks, priority above all other maintenance. The design was simple enough that any competent welder could build one. The materials were literally lying all over the battlefield, destroyed German obstacles waiting to be repurposed. But Bradley's staff recognized they needed more than improvised production. They needed standardization, mass production, and quality control even in field conditions. Lieutenant Colonel John Welburn, 1st Army Ordnance Officer, coordinated what became one of the war's most successful emergency equipment programs. Mobile welding teams formed from ordnance companies moved from unit to unit, fabricating and installing cutters. The design was refined through rapid iteration. Original 4-prong design evolved to 6-prong and eventually 8-prong configurations. Engineers discovered optimal prong angles, spacing, and lengths through trial and error conducted in actual combat conditions. Materials came from multiple sources. Primary source remained German beach obstacles. Thousands of tons of high-quality steel deliberately placed where Americans needed it. Supplementary materials included destroyed German vehicles, salvaged railway track, structural steel from damaged French buildings, and even purpose-fabricated steel shipped from England once the design was proven. Production statistics told the story. July 2 through 4, 50 cutters fabricated and installed, proof of concept phase. July 5 to 10, 300 cutters produced, initial mass production. July 11 through 20, 500-plus cutters installed across all armored units in Normandy. July 21 through 31, production exceeded demand. Every tank that needed a cutter had one. By late July, essentially every Sherman tank in Normandy had been modified with hedgerow cutting teeth. The transformation from concept to fleet-wide implementation took less than 4 weeks, a timeline that would have been impossible through normal military procurement, but was achieved through field improvisation and command priority. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from German LX-84 Corps defending the bocage sector noted in mid-July, American tanks have been modified with steel prongs that allow them to penetrate hedgerows directly. Previous defensive advantage of terrain is significantly reduced. American armor now advances through bocage with speed approaching open terrain movement. Defensive tactics require immediate revision. The tactical revolution. The Rhino Tank, as soldiers nicknamed the modified Shermans, after the animal that charges through obstacles, transformed bocage warfare overnight. Tactics that had been impossible became routine. Pre-Rhino bocage assault. Infantry advances under fire across open field.
Infantry assaults hedgerow position. Infantry attempts to clear defenders. Tank supports from distance, but cannot close due to terrain. Casualties heavy. Time required, 30 to 60 minutes per field. Post-Rhino bocage assault. Rhino Tank drives directly through hedgerow into defender's field, bypassing prepared positions. Infantry follows through breach. Defenders forced from positions by tank's presence behind them. Next hedgerow breached immediately. Multiple fields cleared rapidly. Casualties light. Time required, 5 to 10 minutes per field. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. American tank crews, demoralized by weeks of fighting in death traps, suddenly had a weapon that gave them the initiative. German defenders, confident their hedgerow positions were nearly invulnerable, found American tanks appearing in their rear areas without warning. The 3rd Armored Division, equipped with Rhino tanks in mid-July, demonstrated the new capabilities. On July 26th, attacking towards St. Lo as part of Operation Cobra, the division advanced 7 miles in one day, more than they'd managed in the previous 3 weeks combined. Casualty rates for tank crews dropped by over 60% compared to pre-Rhino operations. Infantry commanders praised the innovation even more than tankers. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sears, commanding 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, the Rhino tanks changed everything. Instead of fighting for every field with heavy casualties, we follow tanks through breaches and clear scattered defenders. What took hours now takes minutes. Our casualty rate dropped from 15 to 20% per day to 3 to 5%. Morale improved dramatically because men see we're winning instead of grinding forward at terrible cost. The tactical flexibility was equally valuable. Rhino tanks could create breaches anywhere along a hedgerow, not just at gates and gaps where Germans expected attacks. This unpredictability prevented Germans from concentrating defensive fire. Tank infantry teams could maneuver in bocage almost as effectively as in open terrain, using hedgerows for cover while breaching them at will to advance. Operation Cobra, the breakout. Operation Cobra, launched July 25, 1944, would demonstrate the Rhino tank's strategic impact. The operation aimed to break through German lines west of St. Lo and create the breakthrough that would liberate France. The success depended on rapid armored advance once infantry created the initial breach, exactly the type of operation bocage had prevented for 4 weeks. But Cobra would be different. Every Sherman tank in the assault formations carried hedgerow cutters. Tank commanders had trained on breaching techniques. Infantry had practiced following tanks through breaches. The coordination between armor and infantry had been refined through dozens of bocage engagements using the new equipment. The initial phase, heavy bomber strikes and artillery bombardment, created the breach in German lines. Then armored divisions poured through. 2nd Armored Division, 3rd Armored Division, 1st Infantry Division with attached tank battalions. In previous operations, these divisions would have stalled immediately upon entering bocage. With Rhino tanks, they maintained momentum. July 26th, 2nd Armored Division advances 7 miles through bocage. July 27th, 3rd Armored Division penetrates 9 miles, reaches open terrain beyond bocage. July 28th, breakthrough complete. American armor operating in open country. The advance rate, 25 miles in 3 days through terrain that had previously stopped entire divisions, represented revolutionary improvement. German defensive lines, based on assumption that bocage would slow American advance to yards per day, collapsed when American armor maintained miles per day pace. German Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr Division, attempted to establish defensive lines, but found American tanks appearing where no attack should have been possible. His July 28th report: American tanks penetrate hedgerows at any point. No position is secure because tanks can breach into fields we thought protected by terrain. Defensive tactics based on bocage advantages are obsolete. Request permission to withdraw to defensive terrain not offering false security. The strategic impact extended beyond Cobra. Once American forces broke through bocage into open terrain south of the Hedgerow country, the rapid exploitation that American doctrine envisioned became possible. The race across France that would liberate the country by September began with Rhino tanks breaking the bocage stalemate. The German response: too little, too late. German forces attempted to counter the Rhino tank through various means, all ultimately ineffective. Their responses revealed how completely the simple innovation had upended bocage warfare. Tactical response: German units attempted to position anti-tank weapons to cover all possible breach points rather than focusing on roads and gaps. This dispersed defensive firepower, making all positions weaker. Units also attempted to create secondary hedgerow positions behind the first line, but Rhino tanks breached these just as easily. Obstacle enhancement: engineers attempted to reinforce hedgerows with mines, wire, and anti-tank obstacles. These measures slowed Rhino tanks slightly, but couldn't stop them. The tank's momentum and power overcame obstacles that would have stopped unmodified vehicles. Technical analysis: German intelligence obtained photos and descriptions of Rhino modifications. Engineering assessment concluded the design was simple, effective, and impossible to counter without fundamental tactical changes. Recommendation to develop similar capability for German tanks was rejected. German armor doctrine emphasized different tactical approaches, and Germany lacked the field fabrication capacity to retrofit existing tanks.
Strategic reassessment. German High Command recognized that bocage, counted on to provide months of defensive advantage, had been negated by simple American modification. This forced revision of defensive strategy throughout France. If terrain couldn't stop American armor, only prepared fortifications with adequate anti-tank weapons could slow the advance. The most significant German response was absence of effective counter. German doctrine and equipment development emphasized sophisticated solutions to tactical problems. The idea that a simple welded modification using scrap metal could revolutionize warfare didn't fit their engineering mindset. By the time Germans fully understood the Rhino tank's impact, American forces had already broken through bocage and were advancing into open country where the hedgerow problem no longer mattered. The recognition and refinement. Sergeant Curtis Culin's innovation received official recognition remarkably quickly given military bureaucracy. On July 20, 1944, General Omar Bradley personally met with Culin to thank him for the innovation that had solved First Army's greatest tactical problem. Bradley recommended Culin for the Legion of Merit, high recognition for an enlisted man. But more important than personal recognition was the systematic refinement and standardization of Culin's innovation. What began as improvised field modification evolved into standardized equipment through rapid iteration. Mark I Rhino, original Culin design, 4 prongs, variable length, fabricated from available materials, effective but inconsistent performance based on fabrication quality. Mark II Rhino, 6 prongs with standardized spacing and angles, improved penetration and stability. This became the most common configuration. Mark III Rhino, 8 prongs with reinforced mounting, optimized for heavy bocage, used by lead tanks in assault formations. Engineers also developed installation procedures that reduced fitting time from several hours to under 1 hour. Standardized mounting brackets allowed quick removal and replacement of damaged prongs. Quality control procedures ensured reliable performance despite field fabrication. Interestingly,
The innovation also spread laterally through informal channels. British forces, fighting in the same bocage sectors, observed American Rhino tanks and requested technical details. Within weeks, British tanks were being similarly modified. Canadian forces adopted the modification. Even Free French armor received hedgerow cutters. The design was never classified. Its effectiveness depended on implementation, not secrecy. German forces knowing about Rhino tanks didn't help them counter the devices. This was warfare decided by practical innovation rather than technical secrets. The human dimension. Behind the statistics and tactical analysis were soldiers whose lives were directly affected by Culin's innovation. The testimonies from tank crews and infantrymen reveal the personal impact. Lieutenant James D. Francesco, who commanded the first Rhino tank through a hedgerow. Before Culin's invention, we were scared every time we approached a hedgerow. You knew the Germans were waiting. You knew your tank was vulnerable. After we got the cutters, we owned the bocage. We could go anywhere, breach any hedgerow. The psychological change was as important as the tactical advantage. We went from feeling trapped to feeling invincible. Private First Class Martin Horvath, infantryman with 29th Infantry Division. The Rhino tanks saved my life and probably saved my unit. Before them, we lost men every time we crossed a field. After them, we followed tanks through breaches and cleared scattered defenders. Casualties dropped dramatically. Morale went from desperate to confident in days. We went from thinking we'd never get out of Normandy to believing we'd be in Germany by Christmas. The casualty statistics supported these testimonials. Infantry divisions operating with Rhino tank support showed casualty rates 40 to 60% lower than the same units had experienced in early bocage fighting. Tank crew casualties dropped even more dramatically, over 70% reduction. The psychological impact extended to new replacements arriving in Normandy. Soldiers who reached the front after Rhino tanks were deployed didn't experience the demoralization that had affected earlier units. They arrived expecting American forces to dominate, and that's what they saw. The strategic lesson. The Rhino tank story illustrates a broader principle about military innovation, that sometimes the most effective solutions come from practical problem-solving at the lowest levels, rather than top-down technical development. The U.S. Army's official tank development program, operating through proper channels with engineering support and testing protocols, had failed to solve the hedgerow problem despite having months to work on it. Sergeant Culin, with no engineering training and using scrap metal in a field workshop, solved it in an afternoon. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Many of the most effective American innovations came from soldiers improvising solutions to immediate problems. Add-on armor for trucks, field-expedient weapons mounts, modified ammunition loads, and improvised communication systems. American military culture that encouraged initiative and tolerated unofficial modifications enabled innovation that more rigid systems couldn't match. The Germans, despite having superior engineering capabilities in many areas, struggled with this type of field innovation. Their military culture emphasized following doctrine and using equipment as designed. Field modifications were rare and often officially discouraged. When confronted with unexpected problems like bocage warfare, they waited for higher command to develop tactics and equipment to exploit it, which never came because German industry couldn't spare resources for what seemed like a minor tactical issue.
The post-war legacy. The Rhino tank's influence extended beyond World War II. The concept of mounting auxiliary equipment on tanks to overcome specific obstacles became standard practice in armored warfare. Modern tanks routinely carried dozer blades, mine plows, and breaching equipment, direct descendants of Culin's improvised hedgerow cutter. The U.S. Army's Tank Urban Survival Kit, TUSK, developed for Iraq operations, includes reactive armor, shields, and breaching equipment mounted on standard M1 Abrams tanks, following the same principle of adding specialized equipment to standard vehicles for specific tactical situations. More broadly, the Rhino tank validated the concept of field modification and rapid adaptation. Modern military forces emphasize adaptability and encourage field-level innovation in ways that were revolutionary in 1944, but are now standard practice. The Army's Rapid Equipping Force, established in 2002, exists specifically to identify field-identified needs and provide solutions within weeks or months, rather than years, institutionalizing the approach that produced the Rhino tank. The principle that soldiers facing tactical problems often know better than distant engineers what solutions will work has become accepted doctrine. Conclusion: from impossible to routine. When Oberst Rudolf von Gersdorf told his staff in early July 1944 that American armor was trapped in bocage and breakthrough was impossible, he was making a reasonable assessment based on German military doctrine and 4 weeks of observation. Every tactical principle said tanks couldn't advance rapidly through hedgerow country. Therefore, the bocage would stop the Allied offensive. He was wrong, because German doctrine didn't account for American capacity for field innovation. The assumption that tactical problems required complex solutions developed by engineers missed that sometimes a simple modification by a practical sergeant could revolutionize warfare. Culin's hedgerow cutter, fabricated from scrap metal in a field workshop, proved more effective than any official solution. The design was crude, inelegant, and violated numerous engineering principles about proper tank modification. It worked perfectly. Within 3 weeks, it had been mass-produced in field workshops and installed on hundreds of tanks. Within 5 weeks, it had enabled the breakthrough that liberated France. The German generals who said hedge-to-hedge fighting was impossible for American armor learned that impossible often meant we haven't figured it out yet. American soldiers figuring it out, implementing the solution immediately, and sharing the innovation fleet-wide demonstrated a military culture that German rigid hierarchy couldn't match. By late July, when American armor was racing across France, bocage was a footnote, a tactical problem that had briefly slowed the advance before American ingenuity solved it. The hedgerows that German doctrine said would take months to penetrate were breached in seconds by tanks with welded teeth. Sergeant Curtis received his Legion of Merit in October 1944. The citation noted that his initiative and ingenuity in developing a hedgerow cutting device for tanks materially contributed to the success of armored operations in Normandy. The understated military language barely captured the impact. His simple innovation had broken the bocage stalemate, enabled Operation Cobra, and begun the liberation of France. In 1990, at a 46th anniversary D-Day ceremony, an aging Curtis Culin watched footage of Rhino tanks smashing through hedgerows. Asked how he felt seeing his invention in historical context, he gave a characteristically practical response. "I saw a problem, I figured out a solution. That's what soldiers do. I'm just glad it worked and saved some lives. That's all that mattered." That practical mindset, see problem, figure out solution, implement immediately, was as much a weapon as the steel teeth welded onto tank fronts. German doctrine said bocage breakthrough was impossible. American sergeants said, "Watch this," and proved doctrine wrong.